Andy, I hope you find this helpful. These are just a few notes that I've put together from the programs you supply me with. 1970-71 season. I was interested to see there were actually no league tables for Division 2 for that season, but I do recall that the away form of no wins epitomised my early recollections of Charlton. There was a note in an end of season programme for 69-70 which recorded that they actually had no wins at all in that season. And the following season, which was 1970-71, on the 28th of November they played QPR away at Loftus Road and won 4-1. And I remember at the time in the family, Martin, Dad and I were absolutely staggered by this result. They were 3-0 up at half time, which we couldn't believe, and overall won 4-1. And the domination of that result in the next programme notes demonstrates just what an unexpected result that was. From an interesting sort of social history point of view, Charlton played in red and black stripes, and I think that was the first season that they had a really jazzed up away kit. Before that had been white with black shorts, and that was following the rather flamboyant lead taken by Manchester City, who I think were the first to change from their light blue strip to playing in red and black, green and black, and very flash kits. Just as an interesting aside, I don't know whether this is of any interest for your book, but around Christmas time they played Blackburn at home, which was a relegation clash even at that early stage of the season. If my memory serves me correctly, I was at a birthday party. I would have been about 10, and I do remember at the birthday party that quite a number of us boys who played football together, we kept on dashing out and trying to get hold of the result, but in the end had to wait till the end, and I think they lost 4-2 at home to Blackburn that day, because back in 1970, and even really for most of the early 70s, we didn't get the coverage that you get now on LBC or GLR or Capital Radio, where you have almost minute by minute coverage, and certainly coverage by every time there's a goal you go to the ground. It was certainly different in the 70s. Occasionally, if Charlton were in a top game in Division 2, they might be on Sport on 2, but often you wouldn't get the half time, and you'd have to watch the teleprinter on grandstand and watch that teleprinter go across your screen about 4:45 before you had any idea how Charlton had got on. Season 71-72, this was my earliest memory of a really dire result. They actually played Tranmere Rovers in the Cup, who were then in the 4th Division, and they drew 0-0 at home. Tranmere very sturdily held them to a draw. Ron Yates and all, who'd moved there from Liverpool. So it was really bad news going to school on the Monday, with everyone sort of rubbing my nose in the dirt that they'd drawn. But it was even worse the next day, because Tranmere played on the Monday night in those days, and which I think they still do, and they beat Charlton 4-2. So I had a bad day Monday, I had an even worse day Tuesday at school. Can't recall anything too interesting about season 72-73, because that was their first year in the 3rd Division. But what I do remember broadly was a recollection of one of loads of goals scored at Charlton. Quite a common result was the 3-3 scoreline in that season. There were plenty of goals, and what I do remember is my friend John and I used to go from Eltham to the game, and I'd walk up to his house at 2:30, and we'd have a cup of tea and leave with his future brother-in-law to be, and so we'd leave just about 3:20 from Eltham, and we'd get to the ground in 10 minutes and just stroll round so you could get to the ground really late. The following season, just looking through the programmes, as far as I can remember, it was a similar pattern with some really high scoring games. I felt at that stage that Charlton weren't actually going to get out of the division. They had a very potent attack and a very swift attack, but they had a woefully inadequate defence, with people like Shipley, who was cumbersome, Warman, who was better going forward than defending, and Ray Tunbridge, who I don't know if he ever was featured in the Red Faces in voice of the valley, but he certainly should have been. Above all, they were unpredictable more than anything. They stuffed Oldham at the end of the season, who were promoted. I think it was that season anyway, and they really walked the division, Oldham. But they came to Charlton and were beaten 4-1. And around that time, Charlton, of course, embarked on that mesmeric, and I don't know whether it still stands as a record, their run under floodlights, where they went 22 games over the course of 2 or 3 seasons without being beaten, and scored roughly 3 goals a game. Let in about a goal every game as well, a goal or 2 every game, but scored 3 goals a game, which is really quite an incredible record when you think about it. The following year, 74-75, Horsfield was moved back to centre half with David Young. And I remember a game in October against Peterborough, when I think both sides were mid-table. Looking back at the programme, no sense at all that Charlton were going to be promoted that year. They conceded a number of goals, but then they had very impressive home form during the new year, the run up until Easter. And it started with a home win over Colchester, I think New Year's Day, or it was the New Year game when they won about 4-1. And I remember I was in Greenwich in the evening, and went along to the game from Greenwich, and the lower row was packed. I mean, everyone was going to the ground with the same sense of purpose to see Charlton win, because the feeling had started to grow then that Charlton at least had a chance of going up. And there was about 12 or 13,000 then, which was a fair crowd for a third division game. And then they had some really fantastic crowds. Plymouth away was almost 30,000, Gillingham and Crystal Palace at home, really, really big crowds. And then, of course, Preston North End, which was in April, where they finally sealed it. They'd had a very indifferent run-up, where they sort of spluttered for the last part of the season. And then, of course, against Preston, they were 1-0 down at half-time, and Curtis had missed a penalty. And then they sealed it with 3 goals in the second half. Once they scored and equalised, it was just a question of how many. And we were all, in those days, there were no fences around, and we just all climbed over at the end. Not all of the 25,000, but a good number of them just went onto the pitch and were calling for the players to come out. And I've still got a piece of the pitch. That's in my mum and dad's garden at home in Elton. The previous Saturday to that, I'd gone to Chesterfield, and I went on the coach. Now, it's some time since I've been on the coach to an away game, but in those days Lewis's would get you there really early. It'd be like a day out, and you'd get to the venue about midday, and this was no exception. So we went all the way up to Chesterfield, and I went with a pal of mine. We got there at midday and had no idea what we were going to do till kick-off, so I think we went into Littlewoods for a meal and hid in our scarves, and that was £1.80 return fare, and it was a dreadful return journey because they lost 2-0. The following season, 75-76, was their first back in the second division for 3 years. They played a number of Friday night games that year, about 7 or 8. Just an interesting aside, I don't know whether it's relevant for your research for your book, but I noticed the name Bob Hatton features a lot in the programmes you've given me, and again, they played Blackpool that season, and Bob Hatton was playing, and I remember him playing for Luton and Wolverhampton Wanderers, and it seemed to me, and Carlisle as well, and it seemed to me whenever he played against Charlton, he always scored, and sort of during the 70s, he certainly was a thorn in the side of Charlton. And so was Burridge as well, the keeper. I think he played for Palace and Wolves, Sheffield United and Southampton and others. And it wasn't until Charlton beat Sheffield United 2-0 at Selhurst Park in the second division, the year they came up, that I don't recall Burridge ever being beaten on by a Charlton side. Anyway, I remember in that season, on the 26th of September, they played Hull on the Friday night and won 1-0 and went 8th, something like that, and that was like the dizzy heights in the division. And again, that was it was similar to the period I described at New Year against Colchester, when on a Friday night, if you were sort of walking along the lower road, everyone was going to the Charlton game, and it was a really good atmosphere. And I remember that night was a marvellous goal. Peacock floated a free kick over to Hales, and it was a brilliant goal, and started to get a sense then that Hales was going to be able to repeat what he'd already started the previous year in the third division and be really the most phenomenal finisher that I can ever remember playing in Charlton's colours, certainly in my lifetime. There were other Friday night games that stick out as well. They played Southampton on a Friday night and beat them 4-1. It really was a terrific performance. In November, we went to Craven Cottage, a few of us, and I remember this quite clearly because as we were coming out of the ground, they'd drawn 1-1, and it was a very good game of football, and Charlton had looked a really sound side. And there was a comment by a fellow supporter as we came out, who sort of was I suppose a contemporary of my dad, who said he thought they were a good side, and they were actually on a very good run at that stage. I think they'd gone a number of games without defeat, and he was saying things like, could be that this is their season, and it started to sow seeds in my mind, because they were on a good run. They were about 7th or 8th, and the following day in the Sunday Express, Dennis Compton, who used to write reports in the Sunday Express, who quite often covered Charlton, had said how impressed he was with the game, the open game, and how impressed he'd been with Charlton's attitude and approach, and he felt under Andy Nelson that they certainly had a good chance of promotion. And as often happens, as soon as seeds are sown in your mind, they're quickly crushed, and the following Saturday we played Sunderland, and again another side who I always remember being quite a bogey side to Charlton, and they lost 2-1, and I think that was even worse. That defeat was compounded by the fact it was covered on TV, and I think they had quite a few defeats then up until Christmas. Boxing Day that year, 75, they played Portsmouth, and I remember they laid on a coach and horses, the mail run, and that actually went past Whitehall Road, went past where Mum and Dad live, and we were waiting for that to go by, and then went off to the ground. I think we walked in those days. That was the start of no public transport on Boxing Day, or it may have been after that, but certainly we walked to the game. That was. Just as an aside, it was a disastrous game. Charlton lost 3-1 at home to Portsmouth, who were languishing, I think, either at the foot of the division or very close to the foot. But later that year, 75-76, during January and February, they made up for it with a really good cup run. Beat Sheffield Wednesday and Pompey away, after Pompey had drawn with them at home. And there were some marvellous games during the latter part of that season, and they actually ended the season really well with 3 wins and 5 draws. And it made one wonder, because they finished, I think, about 9th, and it did make one wonder what would have happened if they hadn't fallen away quite badly during November, December, January, February, because the programme notes, of course, were welcoming teams at the end of the season who were in the running for promotion, and I certainly felt Charlton could have been in with more of a shout if they just held it together for those few weeks either side of Christmas, because that would have meant an extra at least 8 or 9 points, which could have certainly had them nudging second place. I mean, some of the games that season was the nighttime games anyway. They played Fulham in February and beat them 3-2 with a Hales hat-trick, and Hales scored in the last minute. Later that month, I mean, we were almost spoilt for choice. They played Forest and Carlisle 2 games in a week, and they drew with Forest in a really good game, 2-2, and then beat Carlisle 4-2 after being 2-0 down. And they had a lot of games that season where they conceded a 2-goal lead, if I recall correctly, but in that case against Carlisle they actually came back from being 2-0 down. And then later in the season they played Bristol City, who I think went up as eventual champions and were certainly top at that stage and had hardly been beaten. And of course Charlton really gave the run around. They were just a different team under lights, and Bristol City were very lucky to get 2-2 draw. Charlton scored twice in about 30 seconds after being a goal down, and Bristol City only equalised through a handball goal rather. The last game of the season saw Bolton, who were pushing for promotion, come into the Valley, and by that time attention had started to focus on whether Hales would score enough goals. He'd got 28, and if you got 30 goals in the season, you'd get I think something like the Golden Boot Award, but certainly £10,000. And of course Charlton failed to score at home for the first time in a match, any sort of match all season, so there have been about 25 games. So Hales didn't get the record and Charlton lost 4-0, but Bolton didn't get promoted. I think West Brom pushed them out. I think I ought to also mention that earlier than this, about between season 72-73 if I recall correctly, during May, June, July at school, my pals had all been saying what summer jobs they were going to do and the money they were going to earn. And I think looking back, was in a situation where I didn't really want to work and give up all my summer holiday, but on the other hand it would be nice, I thought, to have some extra pocket money coming in. And years ago Martin had worked on the ground staff, I suppose back in the early 60s, maybe late 50s. He'd worked on the ground staff during the summer, just doing odd jobs and painting and maintenance. So I thought, right, I'll go down and ask. So I went down to the ground and asked to see the groundsman, Maurice Banham, and he offered me the job on the spot, to work with another youngster who I think had been there before, and I was offered £2 for the week. And when I went back home and told Mum, she phoned up Charlton straight away and said, he's not going to work for that little money, and I think they gave me a 50p wage rise. So it must have been post-decimalisation. I think it was about 72, so I worked for £2.50 a week. I think that's probably the sort of wages Charlton are paying now. Anyway, that was a really good time during the close season. I got all the players' autographs. One player who was very new to the Valley at that stage was Hales. He'd just come from Luton. But someone who I remember being very nice was Bob Curtis. Other players that were very courteous as well, Colin Powell and Arthur Horsfield. Colin Powell was a very genuine guy, very warm, and he was often, I couldn't understand it at the time, often talking gardening and shop with Maurice Banham, the groundsman. And of course, Colin now is the groundsman for Charlton. I mean, there were lots of menial tasks like painting, and there were a few pre-season friendlies, clearing up after those the following day, clearing up the terraces. I remember I painted the gates at the Sam Bartram entrance, and painted the exits where you go down the steps, and whitewashed those, and cleared out the players' dressing rooms. And I remember one day I'd actually swabbed the floor with a mop, and Flanagan came in with his dirty boots and walked right across the floor. And he was just coming to prominence then with his runs down the left wing, and substitutions coming on and scoring quite late and important goals. And even in those early days, he was called Flash, and he did think highly of himself. I don't know whether that's changed, but he certainly was a very arrogant young player. The other thing, of course, as part of the bonus of being a Charlton employee, was that I actually got into quite a few games at the start of the season free. I didn't take advantage of that for very long though. Theo Foley was the manager, and I remember often during the long hot days I'd stop work and watch the players train on the pitch, and I remember thinking how sharp they were. They looked very sharp in training, of course not playing against anybody else, and I was telling everyone how good they looked in training, and they were going to be dead certs for promotion. They were still in the third division at that time, so I think it was about 73. And the first game of the season they played York City, and I'd encouraged, I think, one or two people who were very impressed that I'd managed to get a job on the ground staff. I'd encouraged them to come down and have a look at Charlton. And of course, I'd got a slightly distorted view without them playing opponents, and they got beaten about 4-1 by York at home on the opening day of the season. York did eventually get promoted, but I wasn't to know that at the time. It was a real loss of face with my pals. Getting back to the programme notes, season 76-77 was a season of great promise after Charlton had finished quite well in the second division the previous season. What I do remember is that they had some very big wins early on in the season. They beat Luton 4-3, Southampton 6-2, Sheffield United 3-2. And that was quite an ill-tempered game against Sheffield United. Jimmy Johnston was playing for Sheffield United. Not because he was playing, I must admit, but Charlton were twice losing in that game to Sheffield United, and Flanagan and then Hales scored. Both of them scored outstanding individual goals. And straight from the kick-off, Sheffield United kicked off, and Hales made a very late tackle on John Flynn and broke his leg, and I don't think he played again after that, and there was a lot of acrimony about that. It was a bad tackle. And then Charlton beat Plymouth 3-1 in the November, which I think was the last time Hales scored for Charlton, and shortly after that he was on his way to Derby County. Always remember later on that year, or later on that season, Hales was interviewed by Brian Moore on London Weekend in a very garish suit, and there'd been quite a lot of debate about Hales' ability to score in the First Division, and whether in fact he should have left Charlton that side and the sort of side he was going to, because of course Derby at that time had some very able players in, like John O'Hare and Kevin Hector and Charlie George and Archie Gemmell, but all of them were runners with the ball and ball players. They didn't actually pass particularly quickly. They liked to run with the ball, and of course what Hales had was people like Powell and Flanagan, who were not only swift but released the ball and gave him the ball ahead of him, and I think he found it much more difficult with his back to goal. But anyway, Brian Moore was asking him about his what he'd felt like about leaving Charlton and going to Derby, and I remember he came out with this classic quote that he said that he'd thought he'd found heaven, but when he got there the gate was closed. Flanagan took over from Hales in sort of taking on the mantle of goal scorer. We went off the boil in the new year, which is the early part of the year 1977. I don't remember too much about it except the programme says we did draw quite a number of our games, but we did beat Chelsea 4-0 on Easter Monday night, which meant our ground was ruined by the Chelsea fans, but Flanagan got a really good hat-trick that night. Just to mention briefly from season 1977-78 a few things of note. In October 77, Charlton played Brighton, who were managed at that time by Alan Mullery, and were unbeaten. I think both teams had played about 8 or 9 games. And Brighton came to the Valley, and there was about 20,000 there on a Tuesday night, and it was a game that sticks out in my mind then, and it does now. I can remember a lot of how the goals were scored in some detail. And I remember that I couldn't really sleep that night. It was the most exciting game I'd ever seen. Charlton raced into a 2-0 lead through Macaulay and Tideman, really before Brighton had got any mud on their shorts. And Brighton had a guy called Peter Ward playing for them, who was really, you either loved him or you hated him. He was a really irascible character, but a very gifted footballer. And he brought them back into the game, and shortly after half-time, in fact, they were leading 3-2, and then Charlton equalised straight away, and then there was a real sort of last great battle, both sides going for the winner, and you knew that if whoever would score would win, and Charlton did score, and it was a great game. And then later that month they beat Spurs 4-1 in which, I must admit, it was quite a flattering scoreline, but I've started to think they might actually make it to the First Division. Flanagan scored a hat-trick then as well, but it was a terribly one-sided game. From Spurs' point of view, really, they created a lot of chances and were much better side on the day. And I've never seen, I don't think, such a flattering scoreline for Charlton, anyway. But just as again, something interesting perhaps for your book, when I was going into the ground, Floyd Road entrance, with a lot of Spurs supporters, and of course it was their first visit, lots of them, to the Valley, and as they went in, they were asking me where the pitch was. Because of course at Spurs and a lot of First Division grounds, you actually go in and you're on the terraces, or you're actually by the pitch. But of course at that Floyd Road entrance in those days, you had to walk a good couple of 100 yards before you got to the pitch. And it's worth mentioning, I think, some of those photos, particularly on the programmes, where the teams perhaps opposed at the start of the season. You've got that cavernous terracing behind. Of course, the changes to the ground that were taking place at that time, they were sponsored by Fads, and Fads, I think, was on the terracing behind the goal, on the stand behind the goal to start with, which I think went up at the end of the 70s. And of course that famous CAFC stand came down about that time as well. So there were quite a number of structural changes going on to the ground at that time, which are reflected in the photos. I'm sorry, I've checked through photos I've got, and I haven't actually got any photos of the ground, so I can't help you with photos of about 10 years ago. Season 78-79 was an interesting one for different reasons. They had a very good run in the autumn, Charlton, and moved to 5th. And it was interesting because it's the most impressive away form, apart from the year in 1980-81 when they came up from the 3rd Division, and when they were in the 2nd Division coming up. This was the first time back in the autumn of 78 that I really recall Charlton having impressive away record. My memory was helped by the programmes, but I mean, putting aside that phenomenal result at Bristol Rovers when they drew 5-5, there were other games, winning 4-1 Cardiff, I think 3-0 at Leicester, and they were starting to string some really good results away from home. It wasn't matched by the home form, but it was quite a surprise. I remember my memory needed a little jogging when I saw your programmes, just to recall how again, what a talking point it was for Charlton to have impressive away form. They played Stoke in the League Cup, and that was the start of the end of it. Stoke were a very good side, quite an old side, but obviously a side on the way back to the 1st Division. And again, that was a really vibrant night at the Valley. Tremendous support. Must have been again a crowd of 20-25,000 there. And again, as on the big occasions, Charlton either let themselves down or don't get the rub of the ball, or get some unfair decisions refereeing wise, and that was all happened that night. They didn't get the rub of the green, and they certainly got some. One goal at least was handball against them. But it was a really exciting game, and one of the few nights, these nights do stick out, the nights against Brighton or Stoke, or matches in the 3rd Division that I referred to earlier when they were coming up, where not the whole of South East London was alive, that would be an exaggeration, but certainly you'd get to within a few hundred yards of the ground and it would be vibrant and humming, and everyone would be going to the same place for the same reason, and it was terrific atmosphere. Andy, there's a bit more to say, but I'm actually going to switch over in case I sort of come to a sudden halt. There's not much more to go, so sorry if you're getting bored. Moving on to seasons 79-80 and 80-81. These are significant and are actually quite clear in my memory because I was away. I was living down at Plymouth for 2 years because I was studying at Plymouth Polytechnic, and these stick out quite clearly in my mind. The first season, of course, was a very poor season. I think in all they only won 6 games in the 2nd Division out of 42. And I went down to Plymouth in September and didn't come home till the Christmas, and I came home, I got the 6 o'clock train out of Plymouth Station on the Saturday morning before Christmas, with all my gear to get home, because they were playing at home to Leicester City, who were very near the top, and they beat them 2-0, which was, I would say, the surprise result of the day. Certainly it got the headlines. Leicester were, I think, 1st or 2nd and Charlton were bottom, and they played really well, and on the strength of that, a friend of mine and myself went the following Friday around about Christmas time to see them play Luton on the Friday night, and they lost 3-0. I think Bob Hatton scored again. I think he scored first, and then there was a floodlight failure that day, and we were hoping that the floodlights wouldn't work and they'd get the game postponed because their performance had been so absolutely dire, but not to be. And later that season I came home for a mid-term break around about February time, and I saw them beat Bristol Rovers 4-0. Now this was significant because Bristol Rovers were on a very good run. They weren't setting the division alight, but they hadn't been beaten for a long time, and Charlton were, virtually down even, and beat them 4-0. Really good result. And Colin Powell scored with a header. So I think I must be one of the few supporters who can say in that season I actually didn't see them lose at home, and they lost a lot of games at home that season, and saw 2 of their victories out of 3 games, which is a fairly good record. The following season, of course, was a really terrific season. They went down with very few points, and I think probably very little hope of coming back up again. Certainly not straight away, and certainly not with the same players. I don't recall them buying anyone of note, and they came back with the same players. They started the season by playing Brentford in the League Cup, and were 3-1 down from the first leg, and then stuffed them 5-0 in. Really was, a very exciting performance. This was before I returned to Plymouth, and I was seriously quite amazed at how well they performed. They were 2 goals down from the first leg, and Walsh got a hat-trick, and Hales got 2 goals, and I think the cheekiness and audacity of Walsh's hat-trick made me think, goodness me, here's a player in the making, and I think he was only 17 at that stage. But a very good performance. And then the following Saturday, I've never been so certain of the result before Charlton played the game. They played Brentford and beat them really quite easily, 3-1, and it was only a few minutes before they scored at the start of the game, and it was just a question of how many they were going to score. It was almost like a repeat performance, and it was almost as if Brentford were expecting it as well. I then returned to Plymouth and kept in touch obviously with Charlton's results by paper and by phone with Dad, and just following the results. But in September I went to see them, at the end of September I went to see them play Exeter, and they lost 4-3. That was Jeff Wood's final game for Charlton, thank goodness. He made some dreadful errors that day. 2 of the goals he gave away, another one I think the goal kick just made out of the penalty area for Tony Kello to score. And again, it felt like it was going to be a very familiar story for Charlton. They had a very good attack. Hales was back with the club, and Powell was still, although in his twilight, was still one of the best crossers of the ball, and Robinson scored. And then after that, they went 15 games without defeat till Boxing Day. They scored 28 goals and let in 6. Now I'll pick out a couple of games in that run, because they reached a stage, I think somewhere during the early autumn, where it just seemed to me that if you heard that they'd scored, or if you knew that they'd scored, or if you heard their results come up on the radio and it said Charlton won, you just had a feeling the other side weren't going to score. They won a number of games 1-0, as that result obviously shows, with only 6 goals in 15 games. They're not going to let a lot of goals in. I think they'll actually let 2 or 3 in one game against Walsall. But I'll pick out Huddersfield game, which they won 1-0 away, and Chesterfield won 1-0 away, both sides near the top of the table. And I felt then that this was going to be their year. Both sides were very, very strong that they played. And I remember the Chesterfield game, I played rugby for a Plymouth side, and came off the park, and I just rushed it. I don't think I even had a shower. I just stood in front of the TV listening to the results, and when it came out I thought, this is it, because I think they either went top or they went second, but they were on a real crest, and it was really a proud period, because they were having such a good run and getting such good publicity. And I remember the walls of my room were covered with reports of Charlton, not only in the national press but in the local press, which Dad sent out to me. And then of course in the new year of that season they had a really sticky run in, and they only won 2 at home and went up in 3rd position, when really, with Blackburn and Plymouth, when really their performances and certainly their form had suggested they should go up as champions. But during that period they had another good cup run, and I think that culminated in a 4th round game with Fulham away, And again, I came up at the weekend just to see that, and I met Martin at Earls Court Station, and we went over to Fulham, and there was a really big crowd there, about 25,000, and Hales and Shaw scored, and that was a really, really good game. And it was just tremendous. The whole one end of the ground was just all Charlton supporters, and it was a massive red and white, and they weren't on their sticky run then. They were still playing reasonably well, and Hales got a phenomenal goal. And it's out of interest, that's the only time that Martin and I have seen Charlton win away in all the years we've supported them. I don't think Martin's seen them win away since, and I've only actually seen them win away once other than that, and that was at Brighton. That's about the end of my memories. One thing, of course, you need to know, which I must admit with some shame, is that I was at the Maidstone game when, I think this is still some sort of record, when 2 players were sent off from the same side for fighting, Flanagan and Hales. And I remember my pal and I went off to the Bugle Horn in Charlton Village afterwards, and we were really ashamed that night to be Charlton supporters, because Charlton really struggled to draw. They were drawing 1-1 when Hales and Flanagan were sent off, and then were holding on as a 2nd or 3rd division side. I think 2nd division side actually, against Maidstone, who were non-leaguers, holding on with 9 men for a draw, and it was pitiful and abject. And that's about it for my memories. I don't know. Hopefully they've got some relevance for your research. I sincerely hope so. And I hope it's been of some help.